How did the papacy transition from the persecuted catacombs of Rome to becoming one of the most enduring and influential powers in history, eventually becoming a sovereign state at the heart of the Vatican? Welcome to Collapse, where history shifts forever. Today, we delve into nearly 2,000 years of power, faith, and mysteries, the history of the papacy. From the fall of Rome to the challenges of the modern world, the popes have influenced kings, empires, and peoples in the shadows and in the light. But before embarking on a new adventure, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you, and have a nice trip. At the very beginning of the 1st century Anno Domini, the Mediterranean basin was dominated by the Roman Empire, whose authority extended from the Iberian Peninsula to Asia Minor, including North Africa. Since the rise of Augustus, the Pax Romana, a period of relative stability and prosperity, ensured the cohesion of diverse provinces, bringing together Gauls, Iberians, Greeks, Egyptians, and others under a single administrative framework. The Romans built a vast network of paved roads to facilitate the movement of legions, speed up the transportation of goods, and ensure rapid communication within the empire. The Mediterranean, regarded as our sea by Rome, was navigated by ships carrying grain, olive oil, wines, pottery, and artworks. The order imposed by the army, centralized bureaucracy, and the fiscal system fed the imperial power, while the ideology of the Pax Romana translated into a willingness for cultural integration, fostering the growth of Roman cities and the mingling of various influences from known confines. Contemporary to this Mediterranean power, the Chinese Empire was ruled by the Han Dynasty, whose reign extended from 206 before Christ to the early 3rd century Anno Domini. The Han had a centralized administration, advanced technology, and a powerful network of fortifications that ensured stability in the heart of East Asia. Between China and the Roman Empire, trade routes, later known as the Silk Road, facilitated the exchange of precious fabrics, spices, metals, and major inventions. Caravanners, facing deserts and mountains, stopped in Central Asian oases where Buddhist monks, Persian merchants, and Roman ambassadors crossed paths. North of India, the Kushan kingdom controlled strategic routes linking South Asia to Persia and profited from these commercial flows, contributing to the spread of a syncretic culture between the East and the West. To the west of this vast world, the Parthian Empire had established itself in Persia after the fall of the Seleucids, heirs of Alexander the Great. Possessing a feared cavalry, the Parthians frequently rivaled with Rome for control of Mesopotamia, each side seeking to secure the main caravan routes. These land routes, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Iranian plateaus, were essential for the circulation of spices, incense, precious stones, and metals. The Parthian Empire, led by the Arsacid dynasty, asserted itself as a commercial crossroads between Roman West, Kushan India, and Han China. The Parthians taxed goods crossing their territories and developed diplomatic alliances to maintain a fragile balance against the advancement of Roman legions. In this context, each imperial sphere consolidated its authority through commercial wealth, military strength, and the use of imperial ideology, all aware that prosperity also depended on the stability of routes and trade. In the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, Judea was distinguished by the presence of Second Temple Judaism, heir to ancient religious traditions. Since the reconstruction of the Temple in Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile, this region had been characterized by various factions: the Pharisees, fervent defenders of a rigorous interpretation of the law and oral tradition; the Sadducees, linked to the temple's priestly aristocracy; and the Essenes, ascetics living in isolated communities near the Dead Sea. It was in the heart of this spiritual ferment that Jesus of Nazareth appeared. His preaching attracted listeners who were receptive to a message of renewal, even though social and religious tensions remained strong. Rome theoretically tolerated Jewish practices, but required local populations to also respect the imperial cult. The resulting antagonism, considered a challenge to authority, sometimes fueled revolts with dramatic consequences. Meanwhile, the official religion of Rome was based on the veneration of a polytheistic pantheon, celebrated in imposing temples erected in every provincial city. Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, or Mars embodied various aspects of Roman life, from war to fertility. However, so-called Eastern cults also exerted a strong attraction. That of Isis, the Egyptian goddess of fertility, won the favor of port city crowds, while the god Mithras especially attracted soldiers, fascinated by its initiatory rites. The empire's tolerance of these alternative beliefs was due to its pragmatism. As long as the populations recognized the emperor as the divine protector, they could freely practice their rituals. However, this duty to render a unified imperial cult became a major issue of allegiance, as renouncing it amounted to an act of rebellion. Any public rupture with this principle could lead to repressions or political scandals, reflecting the fragility of this controlled plurality. International trade also flourished beyond Rome's direct borders, fueling the demand for rare perfumes, exotic resins, and costly spices. Frankincense from Arabia Felix, modern-day Yemen and Oman, and aromatics from India transited through complex maritime routes linking the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, while caravans traveled across the Arabian Peninsula to reach Mediterranean ports. Roman and Eastern merchants met in cosmopolitan markets, negotiating in Greek, Aramaic, or even Latin for official transactions. These trade flows enriched major urban centers, supporting the rise of local elites, ready to invest in public monuments and temples. Expensive goods like pepper or cinnamon found a place on the tables of the wealthiest, transforming culinary habits and highlighting the exotic tastes of the upper classes. Fiscal revenues from these exchanges contributed to the imperial finances. Languages also dominated this era of interconnections. Greek, inherited from Alexander, still served as the lingua franca in the Roman East, while Latin, the administrative language, prevailed in the West. Aramaic, spoken in Syria and Mesopotamia, facilitated exchanges in a culturally diverse area. Official documents, business correspondence, and literary texts quickly traveled by land and sea routes, fostering the growth of new ideas. A Stoic philosopher could spread his theories from Athens to Alexandria, while an itinerant prophet found in cosmopolitan cities like Antioch or Ephesus, audiences likely to adopt his beliefs. The imperial infrastructure, supported by paved roads and postal relays, made the world more accessible than ever before. In the first decades following the crucifixion of Jesus, around the year 30 Anno Domini, his disciples began spreading his teachings throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. This missionary impulse, notably carried out by the apostles, gave birth to a new religious community distinct from both traditional Judaism and the prevailing polytheistic cults. Initially, believers still considered themselves as a movement within Second Temple Judaism, but they gradually differentiated by recognizing Jesus as the Messiah announced by the Scriptures. In this context, the early Christians gathered discreetly to pray, share commemorative meals, the breaking of bread, and listen to oral teachings. However, their activity remained modest in the eyes of the Roman state, which was not immediately concerned about their development. Ceremonies often took place in private homes, where the assembly was guided by elders or presbyters, the early signs of an informal ecclesiastical organization. The figure of Peter, considered one of the first leaders of the community, quickly gained importance. According to tradition, he went to Rome in the mid-1st century to preach and strengthen the faith there. His arrival in the imperial capital is not directly documented by official records, but later Christian writings and apostolic traditions strongly affirm it. A symbolic dimension is then emphasized. Rome, the center of the Mediterranean world, gradually becomes a strategic hub for the young church. Paul of Tarsus, a missionary apostle who traveled across the eastern Mediterranean, also arrived in Rome, probably towards the end of his life. He was placed under house arrest, although his captivity still allowed a certain degree of freedom to teach. According to the Acts of the Apostles, Paul continued to proclaim the gospel there until he disappeared, probably around the year 64. Both Peter and Paul are believed to have been put to death under Emperor Nero's reign during the first persecutions that explicitly targeted the Christian community. The year 64 is highly symbolic in Christian historiography. It corresponds to the Great Fire of Rome, which ravaged part of the city and required culprits in the eyes of public opinion. Emperor Nero, seeing popular anger turning against him, allegedly designated Christians as scapegoats. It is at this time, according to tradition, that Peter and Paul suffered martyrdom, one probably crucified, the other beheaded, due to his status as a Roman citizen. This event not only left a mark on the minds of the time, but also established the reputation of the Roman community as the heir of apostolic blood. Thus, the future role of the Bishop of Rome draws on this martyred foundation to justify a unique authority over all the nascent churches. After these tragic deaths, the presence of Christian leaders in Rome did not cease. New bishops of Rome succeeded one another, among whom names like Linus, then Anacletus, and especially Clement, often identified as Clement of Rome, who became a major figure at the end of the 1st century. The sources on these early pontificates remain fragmentary, often derived from later episcopal lists, or a few letters deemed authentic, such as the first epistle of Clement, addressed to the community of Corinth. In these texts, one can already discern Rome's intent to maintain a form of doctrinal unity. Theological arguments often rely on the apostles' legacy and the necessity to follow a tradition handed down from Peter and Paul, reputed founders of the Roman Church. These pastoral letters, copied and disseminated, provide valuable insights into the community's lives and the gradual awareness of Roman authority, even though it was not yet structured as a true central government. The concept of clandestinity holds a significant place in the collective imagination associated with the early days of Christianity in the Eternal City, as the cohort of disciples remains a minority and is sometimes suspected of superstitious practices. They retreat to underground spaces to celebrate rites or bury their dead. The Roman catacombs, these galleries carved into soft rock, become Christian necropolises where the faithful discreetly gather. On the walls appear very ancient frescoes depicting biblical scenes or Christological symbols, the fish, ichthys, the Good Shepherd, or images alluding to the resurrection. Although their liturgical use remains partial, these funerary places bear witness to a desire to preserve the faith and memory of the martyrs away from prying eyes. They also constitute a major archaeological reservoir for historians, since they reveal the artistic and doctrinal evolution of the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. Despite the sometimes linear narrative that presents a church in constant conflict with persecutions, the historical reality is more nuanced. The first criminal repressions, such as those under Nero, are more the result of political circumstances. Over time, other emperors, like Domitian, at the end of the 1st century, proposed targeted discriminatory policies, often seeing it as a refusal to participate in the imperial cult, considered a civic duty. Among believers, the refusal to incense the emperor's statue is perceived as an act of sedition. Then, at various times, Roman authorities issue negative edicts against what they consider a growing sect. Under Emperor Decius, around 250, the persecution becomes more systematic. All citizens are required to provide proof of a sacrifice for the Roman gods, attested by a certificate called a labellus. Christians who refuse face confiscation of their property or execution. The waves of repression intensify under Valerian, then reach a peak under Diocletian at the turn of the 4th century, when the Tetrarchy hardens its approach to eradicate what it sees as a threat to the unity of the empire. Among the tragic stories testifying to these ordeals, the Passio of St. Cecilia illustrates the fervor and courage of the disciples. Cecilia, a member of a noble family, is said to have invited her entourage to prayer in her home, dedicating a space to the Christian assembly. Discovered and arrested, she is condemned to death around the beginning of the 3rd century. Tradition tells that despite the executor's attempt to decapitate her, she survives a few more days, singing hymns to Christ. This account, to which critical historiography attributes some legendary embellishments, remains emblematic of the piety of the martyrs and the devotion afforded to them from these early centuries. In this context, official places of worship are unimaginable, so believers meet in house churches, sorts of rooms arranged within private properties. The Eucharist is celebrated there, often on a simple table turned into an altar, and a form of community solidarity called diaconia is practiced. This assistance manifests through food distribution, welcoming the poor, and visiting the sick. Deacons, assistants to the presbyters and the bishop, play an essential role in the practical organization of the community. They collect offerings, fund the care of widows and orphans, and thus contribute to forging the collective identity of Christians, often regarded with curiosity by the surrounding pagans.
Girl, you were killing it. I enjoyed it, Fred. I had Robin and I listening to it too. So we'll talk later. Bye-bye.
Meanwhile, the need to clarify doctrine emerges early on. As communities are scattered and each group receives various teachings, divergences arise regarding the interpretation of Christ's message. Among the early controversies is monarchianism, which affirms the indivisible unity of God to the point of denying any internal distinction between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Conversely, Montanism, inspired by a prophet named Montan in Phrygia in the mid-2nd century, emphasizes new revelations and extreme ascetic rigor. Such controversies provoke local meetings, often called synods or councils, to examine the legitimacy of these teachings. In these assemblies, the Bishop of Rome gradually assumes a prominent role, often that of an arbitrator. His voice counts due to this supposed link with Peter, which gives Rome an increasing moral weight. Over time, theological divergences become more than just internal questions. They become potentially destabilizing issues for the entire Christian community. Bishops and priests seeking guidance often turn to the legacy of the apostles, that is to say, the founding figures who were close to Jesus or his very first disciples. In the minds of many believers, Rome holds a special force due to the presence of Peter's tomb. Tradition sometimes designates it as the chair of Peter, a symbol of guarantee for the correct interpretation of the faith. While this notion of Roman primacy is still far from formally defined in the 2nd century, it is already in embryo when doctrinal and disciplinary crises erupt across the empire. As the number of believers increases, the institutionalization of the Christian hierarchy solidifies. Although the civil obligations of swearing an oath to the emperor persist, these communities do not fail to support each other, especially when the Roman state goes through political and military crises. History mainly remembers the moments when repression becomes more intense. But between these repressions, long phases allow communities to grow, organize networks of support, and form an increasingly structured clergy. The bishops represent the local unity of each urban church, while councils ensure a certain doctrinal coherence throughout the empire. Documents from the time mention the esteem accorded to the diaconate in urban society. Caring for the indigent and the sick offers a positive image, which sometimes leads entire families to embrace the Christian faith. Furthermore, once baptized, new and old believers are formed through rudimentary catecheses, then perpetuate the teaching orally or in writing, using widespread languages such as Greek and Latin. Aramaic, especially present in the East, also remains an important vehicle in Semitic-speaking regions. Throughout the period, from the year 30 to the famous year 313, symbolically associated with the Edict of Milan, Christianity is shaped in a context of contrasts. On one side, the desire to survive persecutions and criticisms requires discretion and internal solidarity, allowing the reaffirmation of identification with the martyr Christ, whose sacrifice is at the heart of the faith. On the other side, a dialogue slowly establishes itself with different philosophical and religious cultures, as the first Christian authors seek to explain the meaning of Christianity to a curious and literate Greco-Roman world. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Tertullian, an African apologist, composed treatises aimed at refuting the accusations of impiety and fictitious crimes brought against Christians. Likewise, Justin of Nablus, known as Justin Martyr, a century earlier, had already centered his defense on the rationality of faith in the one God. All these efforts contribute to the construction of a unified community identity, unknowingly preparing for the great transformation that will occur when Emperor Constantine shows favor towards the Christian cult. When Constantine and Licinius proclaimed the Edict of Milan in 313, the fate of the Christian community definitively shifted towards legality. This agreement, signed in Milan, ended the sporadic persecutions that had until then weakened the Church. For the first time, the Christian cult could be freely practiced in the Roman Empire, equal to polytheistic traditions. Believers emerged from secrecy, erected official places of worship, and established closer contacts with imperial authorities. Constantine concretely supported the Church by granting substantial privileges. In Rome, he transformed the old barracks of the Lateran into a sumptuous basilica, later dedicated to St. John the Baptist and considered the cathedral of the Bishop of Rome. In parallel, to honor the Apostle Peter, he built St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican over a necropolis identified as the site of his presumed burial. This imperial generosity contributed to the rapid growth of Christianity, as it offered a new public status to the community. The end of the persecutions also fostered a stronger organization of the ecclesiastical institution. The bishops, once sidelined by the repressive imperial edicts, gained influence. From then on, they could settle minor civil conflicts and represented an authority capable of assisting the population. In this context, Rome began to claim doctrinal primacy, reinforced by the memory of the Apostle Peter, who was believed to have established the first seat of the Church in the imperial capital. To ensure the unity of this new faith, Emperor Constantine convened the First Ecumenical Council at Nicaea in 325. The main goal was to clarify the nature of Christ, contested by Arianism, a doctrine that denied the eternal equality between the Father and the Son. At Nicaea, the gathered bishops condemned Arianism and formulated a creed emphasizing the full divinity of Christ. This decision strengthened the idea of a common orthodoxy to be respected throughout the imperial territory. The subsequent decades witnessed ongoing heated theological debates marked by other councils. Rome, eager to defend the line defined at Nicaea, relied on the growing authority of its bishop, perceived as the guardian of the faith passed down by the Apostle Peter. Popes like Julius III, between 337 and 352, confirmed the right of the Roman seat to intervene in doctrinal disputes. Through these arbitrations, the papacy slowly reinforced its reputation as the supreme arbiter in Western Christianity. The role of the Bishop of Rome was further solidified under the pontificate of Leo Fern, known as Leo the Great, between 440 and 461. Doctrinally, he left a lasting mark on the Council of Chalcedon in 451 with his Tome, a letter that clearly defined the dual nature, divine and human, of Christ. Politically, Leo thus distinguished himself by meeting the Hun leader Attila in 452, then negotiating with the Vandal king Genseric in 455. This spectacular diplomacy helped protect Rome from complete destruction and gave the pontiff unprecedented moral prestige. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was threatened on several fronts. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns were attacking the wealthiest provinces, while an economic crisis was undermining the state's finances. Emperors, often weak or sidelined by military leaders, could no longer ensure the territory's security. In this context of uncertainty, Leo I's diplomatic intervention illustrated the pontiff's growing ability to supplement a failing imperial power. In 455, despite Leo I's mediation, Rome was sacked by Genseric's Vandals. Although the plundering was less violent than in previous invasions, the event left a deep impression. The Roman population, disoriented, found moral and sometimes material support in the bishop of the city as he managed certain vital resources. From then on, the pontiff's prestige as a protector grew beyond the strictly religious circle. In addition to his spiritual role, the Bishop of Rome already administered real estate and managed alms for the poor. Christian aristocrats, some of whom had embraced the faith since the 4th century, generously supported these charitable works, strengthening the Church's teaching for the less fortunate. Gradually, the people considered the pontiff as a figure with multiple responsibilities, both as a judge, benefactor, and political intermediary. Local elites also became aware of this evolution, by which religious power supplemented a faltering imperial administration. The dynamic of an imperial Christianity continued with the convocation of new councils, where Rome regularly played a mediating role. Within these assemblies, the papal voice carried weight in defining dogmas. For example, at the Council of Chalcedon, where Leo I's Tome was adopted to clarify the nature of Christ. Through this doctrinal authority, the Roman bishop further consolidated his position as the West entered an era of increasing political uncertainties. In 476, the Western Empire definitively collapsed when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus. The imperial structures, already very weakened, could not survive this overthrow, leaving a deep institutional void. In the Eternal City, the Bishop of Rome then became a major pivot, tasked with managing public goods, overseeing food distribution, and maintaining order. This unprecedented responsibility highlighted the central role of the papacy, now indispensable in a West undergoing complete reorganization. Leo the I was already deceased at the time of this shift, but his legacy continued in the approach adopted by his successors. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the first major power to occupy the Italian peninsula was that of the Ostrogoths, a Germanic people led by the ambitious Theodoric, often nicknamed the Great. At first, he maintained relatively peaceful relations with the Roman hierarchy, aware of the symbolic value of the city. Theodoric proclaimed himself King of Italy and wanted to maintain a political balance despite his Arianism, distinct from Catholicism. Although he held strong theological convictions, he did not prevent the Catholic clergy from maintaining its own structures. In the first decades following the deposition of the Western Emperor, the popes found themselves in a position to negotiate their place, taking advantage of the fact that the Ostrogothic authority, based in Ravenna, did not interfere too much in ecclesiastical affairs. This relative tolerance, however, did not put an end to tensions. At the turn of the 6th century, the papacy further affirmed its role thanks to two notable pontiffs, Hormisdas and John I. Hormisdas had to navigate a complex geopolitical context marked by the rivalry between Theodoric in the west and the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius in the east, who sometimes supported doctrinal currents frowned upon in Rome. John I, for his part, was given the delicate mission of representing Theodoric in Constantinople, in hopes of preserving harmony between Western Catholics and supporters of the Byzantine Emperor. This cooperation demonstrates the central role already occupied by the Pope in maintaining a semblance of spiritual unity at the heart of a deeply divided West. The death of Theodoric in 526 and the gradual weakening of Ostrogothic power paved the way for new interventions from the east. In 527, Justinian ascended the Byzantine throne. This ambitious emperor aspired to restore the Roman Empire within its former boundaries and saw the reconquest of Italy as a priority objective. In 535, he launched the Gothic War, initially entrusted to General Belisarius, who entered Sicily and then invaded the southern peninsula. Rome, still under Ostrogothic influence, was soon to suffer the consequences of this vast conflict. The Gothic War, which extended until 554, had devastating repercussions on Italy and on the city itself. Repeated sieges exhausted the Roman population, subjected to shortages and disease. Belisarius endeavored to defend the city despite limited resources, while the Ostrogoths, determined to recapture their symbolic capital, surrounded it multiple times. In this climate of war, the papacy was obliged to play an essential diplomatic role, trying to protect the clergy, safeguard church properties, and negotiate temporary truces to spare the population. When Vigilius assumed the papal dignity in 537, the situation was already critical. Emperor Justinian, who considered the Pope as the guardian of true orthodoxy, compelled Vigilius to go to Constantinople to partake in resolving doctrinal disputes related to the Christological debates of the time. However, this stay in the Byzantine capital turned out to be closer to forced exile than a diplomatic visit. Justinian, strong in his imperial power, wanted to impose religious unity throughout the empire and expected the Pope to approve the councils and imperial edicts on sensitive theological matters. In Rome, this imperial interference aroused resistance among the clergy and the people. Many inhabitants, already experiencing the anxiety of sieges and hunger, viewed the growing grip of Byzantium on local ecclesiastical affairs with a wary eye. Meanwhile, the Ostrogoths attempted once more to reclaim the city. In 546, Totila, the Ostrogothic king, firmly determined to reassert his authority over Italy, succeeded in entering a nearly deserted Rome. Many Romans had fled the fighting or were dying of hunger, and the garrison in place could no longer withstand the assaults. According to tradition, Totila even contemplated destroying Rome to eliminate this symbol of former imperial grandeur. Ultimately, he reconsidered, opting to leave the city standing, though terribly weakened. The religious buildings and several civil infrastructures did not escape the devastation. The walls were damaged, and social cohesion, already fragile, dissipated further. During these events, the political and administrative role of the popes was reinforced, as they were often the only ones concerned with the distribution of food and the maintenance of a minimum of order. In 552, Justinian dispatched a new general, Narses, to complete the work begun by Belisarius. The Ostrogoths, exhausted, permanently lost their grip on Italy when Narses captured their last strongholds. Rome then fell under Byzantine domination, but ancient glory was a distant memory. The population had plummeted. Many historical monuments were partially destroyed or abandoned, and economic activity remained stagnant. The Byzantine officials, installed in Ravenna, administered the peninsula cautiously, without necessarily providing the assistance expected by the Romans. The papacy was thus compelled to assume civil responsibilities for which it was not initially designed. The popes took charge of maintaining the aqueducts that were still usable, organized the supply of grain, and tried to restore a semblance of collective life. This daily management strengthened the community spirit and solidified the image of the pope as a protector both spiritual and temporal. In a dilapidated urban landscape, it often fell to the Bishop of Rome to represent a credible authority, capable of implementing emergency aid and maintaining, however imperfectly, religious cohesion. It was in this climate of deprivation and uncertainty that Pelagius II acceded to the papal throne in 579. His beginnings were difficult, as the Lombards, in turn, threatened Italy by expanding into Byzantine territories. Despite this new danger, Pelagius II set about repairing certain places of worship and assisting the population, which was greatly impoverished after years of conflict. He is often regarded as one of the popes who, in the absence of being able to rebuild major civil infrastructures, firmly believed in the unifying role of religion and mutual aid. In 589, nature dealt a new blow to Rome. The Tiber River, in flood, inundated a large part of the city, devastating homes near the banks and ruining the wheat reserves. The flooded streets facilitated the spread of epidemics, making survival even more precarious for the Romans. The faithful saw it as divine punishment, while the Pope attempted to mobilize the last resources to help the most affected families. In this exceptional context of crisis, Pelagius II wanted to perpetuate a sign of hope amidst disaster. His most emblematic gesture was the solemn dedication of a mosaic in the Basilica of St. Lawrence outside the walls, also known by its Latin name, Sancti Laurenti Extramuros. Located to the northeast of Rome, this church housed the tomb of the martyr St. Lawrence, a deacon executed in the 3rd century, and whose cult was already very popular. By commissioning this mosaic, Pelagius II sought to express collective gratitude for the divine protection the city had, in his view, received. Although the flood had caused immense damage, he hoped to emphasize the unyielding strength of faith that still united the inhabitants. This represented a spiritual triumph amidst the ruins and paid tribute to the courage of those who, under the orders of the Pope, worked tirelessly to heal the city's wounds. The basilica was thus adorned with a decor reminiscent of Rome's past splendor and affirming the church's persistence despite the political collapse. Through this work, Pelagius II proclaimed that, even without the physical presence of an emperor, the apostolic seat remained capable of giving renewed momentum and dignity to the wounded city. At the very beginning of the year 590, Rome is in a state of great distress. Successive invasions, political instability, and demographic decline heavily weigh on daily life. But it is especially the plague, considered a punishment sent from heaven, that afflicts the city. The inhabitants, already weakened by hunger and fear, witness the sudden death of loved ones and neighbors. In the religious climate of the time, many interpret this scourge as a divine trial. It is necessary to implore God's mercy to end the epidemic. It is in this context that Gregory, born around 540 into an aristocratic Roman family, takes a striking measure shortly after his accession to the pontificate. He orders a great penitential procession through the streets of Rome, hoping to appease the divine wrath and obtain the end of the plague. A remarkable personality, he had already demonstrated, even before becoming pope, great dedication in assisting the poor and an acute sense of collective responsibility. During this procession, the crowd, led by the new pontiff, traverses the city chanting prayers for the endangered souls. Rumor has it that angels are singing with the people, and the faithful hope that a miraculous sign will put an end to the disaster. Upon reaching what was once the mausoleum of Hadrian, an imposing funerary construction erected in the 2nd century by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, the participants stop to continue their prayers. It is at this moment, according to tradition, that Gregory looks up and has an exceptional vision. He sees the Archangel Michael at the top of the building, sheathing his sword. This gesture symbolizes the end of the plague. The angel, protector of the city, comes to signify that divine wrath is appeased. After this event, the building gradually takes the name of Castel Sant'Angelo, highlighting the importance of this miraculous manifestation in the Roman collective consciousness. Thus, from the beginning of his pontificate, Gregory is presented as the instrument of divine mercy, which reinforces his moral and spiritual authority. This foundational episode introduces a pontiff who will later leave a lasting mark on the Western Church. Gregory I, often referred to as the Great, governs the papacy from 590 to 604 during a pivotal period. He inherits a devastated and impoverished Rome, caught between the ambitions of the Byzantine emperors and the constant threats from the Lombards, a people of Germanic origin who control vast territories in northern Italy, and whose leaders, converted to Arianism or Catholicism depending on the times, attempt to extend their influence southward. Aware of the theological, political, and diplomatic challenges, Gregory strives to play a pacifying and protective role. He imposes himself as a pivotal figure, reconciling the spiritual authority of which he is the custodian with the necessity of responding to the concrete needs of a destitute population. One of Gregory's major contributions lies in his liturgical reforms. Educated in biblical and patristic sources, he wishes to ensure the unity and clarity of religious offices with an aim for piety and ecclesiastical coherence. He revives certain prior traditions, organizes and codifies them, giving rise to forms of prayer and chant intended to be reproduced throughout Western Christendom. The most well-known legacy of this endeavor is the Gregorian chant, a monodic, liturgical, and vocal musical style, characterized by great sobriety. While the precise organization of these chants was refined after his death, and subsequent codifications also played a crucial role, posterity has remembered Gregory's name for this achievement. This type of chant, as a vehicle for sacred words, helps to standardize and sanctify the liturgy, providing the Church with a powerful means to inspire the devotion of the faithful. In addition to his efforts to strengthen the liturgy, Gregory was concerned with the expansion of the Christian faith into distant territories. At the time, some of the British Isles were not yet fully Christianized, and it was known that ancient pagan traditions persisted in various local communities. Determined to spread Christian teaching to these lands around 597, he sent St. Augustine of Canterbury, a devoted Benedictine monk, along with other religious figures on a mission. Their objective was to evangelize the Kingdom of Kent, ruled by King Ethelbert, whose wife was a Christian. This initiative, supported by Gregory, aimed to consolidate the papacy's establishment in new territories while promoting a Roman pastoral model. The choice of St. Augustine as a missionary was not insignificant. He was reputed for his doctrinal solidity and humility, two virtues dear to Gregory. The initial successes of this mission, notably the conversion of the King of Kent, would establish the authority of Roman Christianity in England and give rise to a lasting ecclesial tradition, later known as the Anglican Church, which remained under Latin influence for several centuries before the later upheavals of the Reformation. On the political front, early 7th century Rome was far from being protected solely by the Byzantine imperial authority, embodied by the Eastern Roman Empire, whose nerve center was in Constantinople. Byzantine rulers often considered Italy as a peripheral battlefield. The Exarchate government, based in Ravenna, theoretically covered all Byzantine Italy, but the means and will to intervene in favor of Rome remained limited. In this relative void, Gregory had to compensate for the absence of a strong power to maintain order and respond to dangers. The Lombards, led by their king and dukes, regularly launched raids or even conquests against territories dependent on Rome, sometimes demanding tributes. Gregory found himself on the front lines to negotiate truces, organize defense, or at least manage the consequences of these incursions. Some sources attribute to Gregory a particularly diplomatic spirit. He knew how to play on internal rivalries among the Lombards, foster ephemeral alliances, and use papal funds to appease enemy demands. He also engaged in regular correspondence with these leaders, sometimes attempting to convert them to Nicene Christianity in order to reduce confessional frictions. In his letters, Gregory often presented himself not only as the servant of the servants of God, a formula of humility that would become the traditional papal signature, but also as an administrator concerned with the common good, alleviating the miseries of the Roman population, feeding the needy, maintaining supplies of grain and oil. These were now tasks incumbent on the Pope, as the imperial authority was too distant to intervene effectively. This involvement in civic life resulted in the gradual strengthening of the tangible role of the Bishop of Rome in the management of the city. In the absence of officially vested governmental powers, Gregory acted as a de facto governor, centralizing charity, public order, and diplomacy. This commitment to the service of Rome significantly elevated the prestige of the papacy in the eyes of the population, as well as among other bishops and Western believers. To support social works and meet the needs of the city, Gregory could count on the lands owned by the papacy. For decades, the Roman Church had been bequeathed agricultural domains, the patrimonia in Italy and even beyond. Among these properties, the latifundia of Sicily played a key role. These vast estates primarily produced grains, oil, and wine, vital goods for a Rome in crisis. Under the direction of papal officials, these domains ensured supply, generated income, and allowed for a policy of assistance toward the needy. Gregory also reformed the management of these properties to limit abuses, demanding that the stewards avoid any oppression of the tenant farmers. Through this administration, he demonstrated a will to moralize the ecclesiastical economy while consolidating resources capable of positioning the papacy as an emerging economic power. This set of estates, grouped under the appellation of Patrimonies of St. Peter, constituted the embryo of a temporal power that would only grow. Gradually, this autonomous and efficient management of land resources allows the papacy to gain sovereignty, especially in a context where imperial legitimacy is manifested only through distant officials. Gregory's efforts to protect and feed the city, his skillful diplomacy with the Lombards, and his pastoral vocation place him at the heart of a redefinition of the role of the Roman seat. Grateful local populations turn to the papal figure for spiritual guidance and concrete solutions to their daily problems. This evolution strengthens Rome's position as an administrative and religious center. For the modern historian, it is evident that these initiatives constitute an essential milestone in what will later be called the Papal States. At this time, however, it remains a form of scattered lordship, without clearly defined borders or official recognition as an autonomous political entity. Beyond his actions in the temporal domain, Gregory maintains spiritual auctoritas through his reform efforts and writings. His letters, collected and disseminated, testify to the extensive correspondence he maintains with the Eastern patriarchs, barbarian kings, and Western bishops. They reflect the myriad concerns of a man compelled to be simultaneously pastor, jurist, diplomat, and administrator. Pastor, when he exhorts priests and deacons to exemplary behavior and active charity. Jurist, when he resolves property conflicts or insists on the need to protect widows and orphans. Diplomat, when he forges links to maintain peace, frequently mentioning divine will as a moral pivot in negotiations. Administrator, finally, as he establishes new rules for church clerks, oversees the management of estates, and allocates revenues. At Gregory's death in 604, he leaves behind a model of papal action that will influence his successors. Despite ongoing crises, the papacy is now not only a spiritual office concerned with the internal affairs of the church, it is also a political and economic actor, ensuring the population's subsistence and balancing the forces threatening the Italian peninsula. In the following decades, Gregory's successors will continue to administer Rome and its surroundings, maintaining sometimes tense dialogue with Byzantine representatives in Ravenna, and reaching occasional agreements with Lombard leaders. Gradually, the moral ascendancy of the papacy over Christian communities goes hand in hand with the acquisition of territories and resources. Without yet being a universally recognized sovereign entity, the See of Peter already behaves like a power in the making. In the mid-8th century, a new era dawns for the Church of Rome and Western Europe. The Lombards, a Germanic European people established in the north and center of the Italian peninsula, dangerously threaten the Eternal City. Pope Zachary, and then his successor Stephen II, seek military aid commensurate with the stakes. Rome, lacking genuine political support since the collapse of Byzantine power in Italy, turns to the Franks. Pepin III, known as Pepin the Short, who has just been recognized as King of the Franks in 751, appears as the ideal ally. Stephen II embarks on a perilous journey across the Alps to join the Frankish court, in the hope of sealing a historic agreement that ultimately will give birth to the Papal States and redefine the political balance in the West. At the time, no one imagines that this alliance, about to be concluded, will have a considerable impact until the 11th century and well beyond. When Stephen II crossed the Alpine passes in 753, he found at the Frankish court a monarch eager to strengthen his spiritual authority through a special relationship with the Bishop of Rome. For Pepin III, the Pope's support legitimized his own position as king, which he had gained with the backing of the Frankish aristocracy, but was still recent. The Frankish kingdom, of Merovingian tradition, had until then been ruled by the line descending from Clovis. The last king of this dynasty, Childeric III, had been deposed to make way for Pepin III. Receiving the papal blessing represented a major political asset. A religious anointment endowed the new sovereign with an almost sacred aura, legitimizing his ascension in the eyes of both the Frankish elites and the local populations. Thus, in 751, even before Stephen II's journey, Pepin III was anointed by Bishop Boniface, the Pope's envoy. But the personal visit of the pontiff to the Frankish court would amplify the symbolic and spiritual impact of this anointment. In 754, Stephen II performed another anointment of the king in the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis near Paris. This solemn anointing was an exceptional gesture. This time, it was not just a papal representative, but the Pope himself, who placed the crown on Pepin's head. The ritual was marked by prayers, the anointing with holy oil, and the participation of several ecclesiastical and lay dignitaries. This crowning nearly deified the power of the Frankish king in the eyes of the assembly. In return, Pepin committed to defending Rome against the Lombards and restoring territories that they had taken around the papal city. Very quickly, the Frankish armies mobilized and achieved victories against the Lombards, enabling the Pope to obtain lands essential to Rome's security. This is the famous Donation of Pepin of 754. The conquered territories were officially handed over to the Bishop of Rome, who thus became not only a spiritual leader, but also a temporal lord with authority over certain Italian regions. This marked the birth of the Papal States, a collection of domains directly administered by the papacy, and Italy now found itself divided among different powers, including the growing Frankish influence. With this alliance sealed, Rome gained a new status. The Church organized the management of these territories, while the Frankish kingdom strengthened itself by escaping the traditional Byzantine interference in the Italian peninsula. But this relatively precarious balance soon began to evolve. In fact, Pepin's son, Charlemagne, ascended to the Frankish throne in 768 and presented himself as one of the most dynamic sovereigns of medieval Europe. He led extensive military campaigns, conceived a vast program of cultural renewal, and felt invested with a religious mission towards his subjects. The crystallization of the collaboration between Rome and the Franks culminated in the year 800, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III, the spiritual grandson of Stephen II. According to the most widespread tradition, the anointment took place in St. Peter's Basilica, Rome, on Christmas Day. Leo III, to thank Charlemagne for saving him from various Roman threats and to secure the support of the Frankish army, conferred the imperial dignity upon him. The act was laden with consequences. It revived an empire in the West, symbolically taking up the torch of the Roman Empire, which had fallen in 476, while simultaneously installing a form of spiritual tutelage of the Pope over the emperor. At the same time, Charlemagne saw himself as the protector of Christianity, enjoying a divinely validated status. To organize this heterogeneous empire, Charlemagne established the Carolingian Chancery, an innovative administrative tool designed to manage and disseminate laws, decrees, and official correspondence. This chancery employed the Carolingian minuscule, a new readable script, and collaborated closely with bishops to promote liturgical reform and clergy training. The Pope, recognized as the supreme head of Latin Christendom, relied on the emperor's structures to extend religious influence and establish doctrinal orthodoxy. Thus was born a symbiosis, frequently described as the alliance of the throne and the altar. In this setup, the emperor provided military and logistical protection to the Church, while the Pope guaranteed the divine anointing of imperial power. Furthermore, both authorities favored the dissemination of Latin culture, the construction of churches, the consolidation of a network of monasteries, and the flourishing of a clerical elite trained in biblical and patristic texts. In the background of this cooperation, a document emerged to bolster papal domination, the Donation of Constantine. According to this text of supposedly ancient origin, Emperor Constantine I in the 4th century supposedly granted Pope Sylvester I supreme jurisdiction over Rome and the entire western part of the Roman Empire. In reality, this document is a forgery likely created in the 8th century or the early 9th century, reinforcing the papal claim to legitimate possession of territories. Although the deception was formally exposed only during the Renaissance thanks to philological studies by Lorenzo Valla, the authenticity of this donation was commonly accepted in the Middle Ages. The popes then used this text as an ideological weapon to demonstrate that their temporal authority had an imperial foundation dating back to the early centuries of Christianity. While it is unlikely that Charlemagne himself was deceived by this document, he tolerated its use to consolidate harmony between the Holy See and the Frankish monarchy. This claim went hand in hand with the desire to exercise doctrinal supremacy over regional churches. The unifying energy created by Charlemagne continued, despite dynastic upheavals under his Carolingian successors. But the issue of papal primacy soon sparked tensions with the Eastern Church, which remained attached to the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Byzantine tradition. In 858, the crisis became concrete with the contested election of Patriarch Photius in Constantinople. Pope Nicholas I, who became pontiff in 858, claimed his right to oversee the nomination of the Patriarch, which the Byzantine imperial authorities refused. For Nicholas I, this affair embodied Roman preeminence. According to him, the city where Peter and Paul were martyred must have supremacy over all of Christendom. He excommunicated Photius, who responded by holding a local council in Constantinople in 867, condemning the Pope in turn. This rupture demonstrated the growing rifts in the unity of the Christian world. Although a temporary reconciliation occurred after the death of Nicholas I, the episode clearly foreshadowed the beginnings of the Great Schism, which would culminate in 1054, with the definitive separation between the Latin Church and the Greek Church. Despite these points of tension, the papacy maintained its prestige in the West. Kings and lords acknowledged the importance of the Roman blessing to establish their legitimacy. With the gradual decline of the Carolingian dynasty, new forces emerged, among them the Saxon line, which gave rise to the Ottonian dynasty in the mid-10th century. Otto I and then Otto II strengthened ties with the papacy by reaffirming the protective imperial role. However, it was during the reign of Otto III, at the very end of the 10th century, that a significant renewal occurred, accompanied by an almost mystical ambition to restore a universal Christian empire. Otto III, educated in Latin culture and inspired by the ideal of a cosmopolitan empire, presented himself as the spiritual heir of Charlemagne, but also as an emperor oriented towards intellectual and artistic revival. In 999, Otto III appointed his former tutor, Gerbert of Aurillac, as pope under the name Sylvester II. Gerbert was a scholar of great renown, having studied the sciences, mathematics, and philosophy. He was one of the first in the West to engage with Arabic translations of Greek texts, particularly in astronomy and logic. As Sylvester II, he thus embodied this confluence of secular power and enlightened knowledge, supported by Otto III. Together, they nurtured the dream of uniting under a single spiritual and temporal authority the majority of Latin Christendom and even establishing bridges with the Byzantine world. This vision, was in line with the belief that the emperor should act as the armed force of the church, while the pope remained its sacred head. However, this imperial universalist project remains fragile. On one hand, Otto III faces internal resistance, notably from nobles keen to preserve their regional autonomy. On the other hand, rivalries with Byzantium and the progressive entrenchment of the two traditions, Latin in the West, Greek in the East, accentuate the divergences. Sylvester the Seine, for his part, tries to extend the intellectual and religious influence of Rome by encouraging the founding of schools and the teaching of sciences, a rare occurrence at a time when monasteries are primarily dedicated to copying sacred texts. The premature death of Otto III in 1002 ends this dream of a unified Christian empire. Although the intellectual imprint left by Sylvester II endures for some time, the rise of regional powers and political conflicts do not allow for the realization of a great empire truly unifying the West. After centuries of fluctuating relations between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, the year 1054 marks a decisive turning point. The schism between Rome and Constantinople becomes irreversible. At this time, the political climate is tense in the Byzantine Empire, while papal authority seeks to assert its spiritual primacy over the Christian world. It is in this context that Cardinal Humbert of Moyen-Moutier, the Pope's legate, goes to the Hagia Sophia in the heart of Constantinople to deliver an act of excommunication. The rupture with Byzantium, often referred to as the Great Schism, results from an intertwining of theological, cultural, and political factors. Indeed, for years, the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople opposed each other on the Filioque, a passage of the Latin Creed, and on the issue of unleavened bread. The direct intervention of Humbert of Moyen-Moutier, accusing Patriarch Michael Thusthefest and Cerularius of various heresies, sealed the definitive separation of the Latin Church and the Greek Church. While Eastern and Western Christianity now evolve along two distinct paths, Rome seeks to consolidate its power in Europe. This quest for affirmation is fueled by the ideals of ecclesiastical reform that have been shaking the papacy since the mid-11th century. The Gregorian reforms, named after Pope Gregory VII, primarily aim to free the Church from the control of secular powers and to refocus spiritual authority on the apostolic see. Gregory VII, a former monk of Cluny before his election, embodies the papal will to end the interference of sovereigns. His objective is to restore libertas ecclesiae, that is, the full freedom of the Church in appointing bishops and abbots. This reform directly collides with the German Emperor Henry IV, who considers the right to invest prelates as a crucial imperial privilege to maintain order in his territories. The conflict, known as the investiture controversy, quickly intensifies. Gregory VII excommunicates Henry IV in 1076, declaring invalid the sacraments celebrated under the authority of this rebellious monarch. Faced with the threat of a revolt by his princes, Henry IV has no choice but to go to Canossa in northern Italy in January 1077. He waits there for papal forgiveness, standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days to finally obtain absolution. This episode of Canossa is a powerful symbol, sometimes perceived as the peak of papal power against temporal sovereigns. However, the quarrel does not end there. Despite his humiliation, Henry IV later takes Rome and forces Gregory VII to flee. The Pope dies in exile in 1085, but his reformist legacy endures. The successors of Gregory VII will maintain the determination to assert the superiority of spiritual authority over political authority. In the wake of these upheavals, Western Europe transforms into a network of increasingly structured states, while the papacy continues to consolidate its spiritual hold. At the end of the 11th century, the Church of Rome, under the pontificate of Urban II, seeks not only to unify Latin Christendom, but also to assert its role as a guide in the face of external threats, including the Turkish presence in the Holy Land. It is in this context that Urban II convenes the Council of Clement in 1095, an ecclesiastical and feudal assembly, where he makes a solemn call to crusade. He urges the lords and knights of the West to take up arms to defend the Christians of the East and reclaim Jerusalem, considered the holy place par excellence. The response to this call is immense. Tens of thousands of people, nobles and commoners, embark on the adventure of the First Crusade. The convergence of these crusades elevates the international standing of the Pope, now perceived as the protector of the entire Christendom. The Crusader armies, despite internal divisions, succeed in capturing Jerusalem in 1099 and establish several Latin states in the east. Caught up in the spiritual and military fervor, the West finds itself durably mobilized around the Crusade cause. The Pope, for his part, becomes the moral and diplomatic coordinator of a vast transcendent mobilization. In the following century, the papacy gains further influence, particularly under the pontificate of Innocent III. He is often considered one of the most powerful popes in medieval history. A man with a very strong canonical and theological background, Innocent III sees himself as the vicar of Christ, endowed with moral authority over all sovereigns. He intervenes in the affairs of the German Empire, imposes his tutelage over Sicily, and acts as an arbitrator in political conflicts. This centralization of papal power also results in the organization of the Fourth Crusade between 1202 and 1204, which was initially intended to assist the Holy Land. However, the Crusaders, manipulated by Venetian interests, divert their expedition to Constantinople, which they pillage in 1204, establishing a short-lived Latin empire on the Byzantine ruins. Although Innocent III publicly deplores this diversion, the territorial gains from this enterprise do, in fact, extend Latin influence in the Mediterranean basin. Institutionally, Innocent III convenes the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a remarkable ecclesiastical assembly due to the number of participants and the scope of its decisions. The adopted canons shape the formation of the clergy, clarify certain essential doctrines, such as the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and reinforce the authority of the Pope over Christendom. This moment illustrates the maturity of the medieval papacy and its desire to standardize religious practice. Beyond major decisions, Innocent III's actions also influence the spiritual movements of the time. Numerous religious orders emerge, advocating evangelical poverty and itinerant preaching. Among them, the Franciscan order, founded by Francis of Assisi, particularly attracts attention. In 1209, this humble and charismatic preacher goes to Rome to orally present his rule of life to the Pope. According to tradition, Innocent III, initially perplexed, eventually allows himself to be convinced and grants verbal approval. The episode of Francis of Assisi would illustrate the pastoral flexibility of the Church, capable of encouraging a new form of religious life centered on fraternity and evangelical simplicity. The growing popularity of this movement promises to play a significant role in medieval spiritual vitality. The Friars Minor gradually settle throughout Europe and, despite some future doctrinal tensions, remain loyal to Rome. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Pope remains the arbitrator of many European conflicts and stands as a moral leader directing successive crusades. But the balance of power is evolving. As the monarchies of France and England strengthen, a growing rivalry emerges between the great courts and the papacy. The kings are no longer as willing to submit without reservation to papal decisions, and tensions arise in diplomatic relations. This climate of competition reaches its peak under the pontificate of Boniface VIII. Coming from the high Italian aristocracy, this pope loudly affirms spiritual supremacy over all temporal authority in the bull Unam Sanctum, promulgated in 1302. In it, he asserts that for salvation, every human being, including kings, must submit to the Roman pontiff. This solemn declaration provokes the fury of the King of France, Philip IV, known as the Fair. The conflict between Boniface VIII and Philip the Fair quickly takes a dramatic turn. The king sends his agents south of Rome to Anagni to arrest the Pope in 1303. This humiliating affront marks the end of the medieval theocratic era, heralding a profound shift. Boniface VIII dies shortly after, leaving the Church in institutional crisis. The period known as the Avignon Papacy begins shortly after the crisis of 1303, when Pope Boniface VIII dies in an atmosphere of extreme tensions between the papacy and the French monarchy. His successor, Benedict XV, fails to fully restore tranquility. Following Benedict's death, the conclave eventually elects Clement V, a native of the Bordeaux region, who decides not to settle in Rome, but to establish himself in Avignon, an area controlled by the Count of Provence and close to the Kingdom of France. In 1309, the new pope officially settles there, marking a major turning point in the history of the papacy. The reasons for this choice include the political instability in Rome, the pressure exerted by the French king Philip the Fair, and Clement V's desire to govern in an environment deemed safer. This geographical break has lasting consequences on the papal prestige. Upon his installation, Clement V implements a centralized papal administration around Avignon. His government is structured through financial bodies, commonly referred to as apostolic chambers, responsible for collecting taxes, tithes, and various levies from the clergy and the faithful across Christendom. This unprecedented centralization consolidates the economic power of the pontiff, while raising criticisms about the presumed rapacity of the Church. Avignon, a modest city until then, is transformed into a cosmopolitan center where cardinals, diplomats, and merchants flock. However, the proximity of the papacy to the Kingdom of France fuels suspicions of royal interference in ecclesiastical affairs. The Italian poet Petrarch, upon visiting Avignon, perceives it as a place corrupted by French influence and openly criticizes the alleged immorality of the papal court, marking through his writings the disenchantment of many contemporaries. French influence grows over the decades, as the popes who succeed in Avignon, such as John XXIII or Benedict XV, are predominantly from France or closely linked to the crown. Prestigious constructions like the Palais des Papes emerge to assert the temporal and spiritual power of the Holy See. The papacy surrounds itself with administrators recruited from the academic and legal elites, reinforcing the papal bureaucracy. Meanwhile, many European kings continue to challenge or negotiate the Pope's prerogatives. Some princes express a form of distrust regarding the neutrality of this pontiff, now distant from Rome. The papacy's image emerges profoundly transformed, nourishing the skepticism of various religious orders, who call for more piety and less lavish spending. The latent tensions crystallize at the turn of the 1370s, when the question of the papacy's return to Rome becomes increasingly pressing. In 1377, Gregory V finally decides to return to Rome, influenced by Italian public opinion and urged by mystical voices such as St. Catherine of Siena, who presses the pontiff to restore the apostolic seat in the Eternal City. However, the reception in Rome is mixed, and the city remains tumultuous due to internal conflicts. When Gregory XV dies in 1378, the Roman conclave, under the pressure of the local population, elects Urban VI, an Italian determined to impose rigorous reform on the Curia. Several cardinals, who deem his election irregular and oppose his authoritarian methods, secede and proclaim an anti-pope in Avignon under the name of Clement VII. By this act, the church splits into two rival obediences, each claiming apostolic legitimacy. This event marks the beginning of the Great Western Schism, which will last nearly 40 years. During this period, two popes reigned simultaneously, one in Rome, recognized by the Italian, English, German, and Polish powers, the other in Avignon, supported by France, Scotland, Castile, and various Iberian kingdoms. The faithful are torn because each obedience excommunicates the other, sowing confusion in Christendom. Medieval universities try to analyze the situation and propose solutions, while princes capitalize on the conflict by negotiating their allegiance to one camp or the other. On the diplomatic front, the rivalry between the two pontificates accentuates the political fragmentation of Europe in a general context of dynastic wars and territorial rivalries. The tier sees a new development when cardinals, weary of the deadlock, organized the Council of Pisa in 1409, meant to end the schism. However, instead of resolving the crisis, this council elects a third pope, Alexander V, and then his successor, John XXIII, plunging the church further into confusion. Faced with this triple division, calls for a general council multiply among theologians and doctors of canon law. The guiding idea is to convene an assembly superior to the authority of the popes themselves in order to restore order in the church and reunify the faith. Under the joint pressure of Emperor Sigismund of the Holy Roman Empire and many renowned prelates, the Council of Constance is convened in 1414. The conciliar fathers examine the claims of each pope and demand their abdication. However, resistances are very strong, as each claims to hold the true apostolic succession. The debates stall, but the desire to break the deadlock gradually prevails. The question of the council's authority over the pope is then at the heart of the discussions, established by the movement known as conciliarism, which supports the primacy of the assembly over the pontifical person. In 1415, one of the claimants, John XXIII, is deposed by the council for attempting to flee Constance and thus avoid the debates that threatened him. Simultaneously, Gregory XIV, the Pope of Rome, voluntarily agrees to step down to facilitate the path to union. On the other hand, the obedience of Avignon, represented by Benedict X, stubbornly refuses to submit, gradually isolating itself. Ultimately, no longer benefiting from any powerful support, Benedict XV withdraws to Spain, while the council continues its work. On November 11, 1417, the delegates, finally agreeing on the necessity of a new single pontiff, elect Martin V. This historic event officially ends the Western Schism, once again uniting the Church under the authority of a single pope. By taking the name Martin V, the new pontiff commits to reforming the ecclesiastical administration and restoring compromised confidence within Christendom. The Council of Constance thus embodies a key moment for the conciliarist movement, which holds that the authority of an ecumenical council can outweigh that of the Pope in the event of a major crisis. This idea, however, clashes with the tradition of the papal monarchy established over centuries. Martin V, while recognizing the importance of the council, soon reaffirms the preeminence of the Roman See. Nevertheless, the decisions taken at Constance lead to a new balance of power within the Church, granting a major role to ecclesiastical assemblies in resolving issues of faith and discipline. On a symbolic level, the end of the schism restores the doctrinal coherence of Christendom and reestablishes the moral integrity of the papacy, even though criticisms regarding finances and certain practices remain. For the faithful of the time, exhausted by decades of uncertainties, this restoration of unity represents an immense relief. The period from 1417 to 1517 marks the entry of the papacy into a phase of artistic and cultural renewal known today as the Renaissance. Emerging from the long crisis of the Western Schism, the Roman Church seeks to assert its authority in Europe while greatly contributing to the flourishing of art and letters. During this century, several popes succeed one another, each adding their personal touch to the papal edifice. From Nicholas V to Leo VI, they radically transform the face of Rome through the construction of new monuments, support for renowned artists, and the promotion of humanism. In a context where the prestige of the papacy blends with a strong desire for intellectual influence, these pontiffs leave a lasting imprint on the history of Christendom and the Western world. Nicholas V, elected Pope in 1447, embodies the hope for a peaceful transition after previous ecclesiastical troubles. Coming from a modest background, he deeply understands the importance of culture as a means to strengthen papal authority and unite the faithful. Recognized for his pronounced taste for erudition, he encourages the translation and copying of ancient manuscripts, thus contributing to the preservation of Greek and Roman thought. His greatest achievement remains the creation of the Vatican Library, a project he initiated in 1451 to establish an essential center of knowledge. Visionary, Nicholas V perceives the value of knowledge in the formation of clerics and the attraction it holds over minds. Thus, the library quickly transforms into an intellectual hub, drawing scholars and literati from across Europe. After Nicholas V's death in 1455, several popes continue his humanist momentum. However, it is under the pontificate of Sixtus IV between 1471 and 1484 that the first great projects of the Roman Renaissance emerge. Born Francesco della Rovere, this pontiff understands the importance of art as a vector of prestige for the Church and invests significantly in ambitious architectural projects. His most famous work remains the Sistine Chapel, built from 1473 on the very site of the old Vatican Palatine Chapel. Wishing to adorn the walls with frescoes depicting biblical scenes, Sixtus IV calls upon many renowned painters. Among them, Sandro Botticelli and Pinturicchio already hint at the magnificence that will later characterize Michelangelian masterpieces. The Sistine Chapel is not limited to its religious role. It also becomes a major ceremonial space where papal conclaves are held. Sixtus IV's patronage extends beyond this mythical place. He supports the construction of bridges, the renovation of roads, and the embellishment of various churches within the city. He also founded the first public library in Rome, annexed to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, thus marking the intention to offer broader access to knowledge. Through these initiatives, Sixtus IV shapes a new urban landscape, combining spiritual grandeur with cultural magnificence. Throughout his pontificate, he promotes the Italian Renaissance as a tool for the worldwide radiance of the papacy. At the turn of the 16th century, the Roman Church reaches the peak of its artistic prestige. Yet, it is under Alexander VI of Borgia, elected in 1492, that one of the most controversial periods in papal history begins. Coming from the powerful Valencian Borgia family, this pope is often accused of nepotism, as he places his relatives in key positions to consolidate his authority. His reign coincides with the rise of the Age of Discovery, and Alexander VI finds himself in charge of arbitrating the division of the New World between Spain and Portugal. In 1493, he promulgates the Bull Inter Caetera, granting a large portion of the discovered territories to the Spaniards. This diplomatic act, bearing heavy consequences for indigenous peoples, illustrates the Pope's dual strategy, maintaining the cohesion of Christendom while reinforcing his own power. Alexander VI's pontificate also accompanies a wave of architectural effort, although his ostentatious lifestyle earns him numerous criticisms. Under his impetus, the city of Rome continues to beautify, attracting artists, intellectuals, and diplomats from all over Europe to the papal court. However, the scandals surrounding the Borgia family, notably the meteoric rise of Cesare Borgia, Alexander VI's illegitimate son, severely tarnished the image of the papacy, to the extent that some contemporaries view his reign as a symbol of moral corruption in the church. Despite this, Alexander VI remains a major diplomatic actor, seeking to marry his children into the great European courts to consolidate his influence. Under his governance, papal authority oscillates between excessive pomp and a central role in the international politics of the era. In 1503, the election of Pope Julius II marked a decisive turning point towards a more structured patronage resolutely anchored in the promotion of the arts. Known as Giuliano della Rovere, he was the nephew of Sixtus IV and thus inherited the artistic ambition of his uncle. Very quickly, Julius II invited to Rome the greatest talents of the Renaissance, among them the Florentine sculptor and painter Michelangelo Buonarroti and the architect Donato Bramante. His reign is characterized by the scale of his construction projects, including the complete redesign of St. Peter's Basilica, whose foundations date back to the Constantinian era. Under Bramante's direction, the ancient appearance of the old basilica was abandoned to make way for a monumental building intended to emphasize the spiritual power of the church. In parallel, Julius II entrusted Michelangelo with other prestigious missions. The sculptor, already famous for his David created in Florence, was invited to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, completed in 1512 after exhausting work. This masterpiece depicts scenes from Genesis, from the creation of the world to the story of Noah, and reveals Michelangelo's genius for spatial composition and the expressiveness of figures. At the same time, Julius II supported Raphael, a young painter from Urbino, tasked with decorating the Vatican's stanze, the official rooms where the Pope held his audiences. Raphael's frescoes, notably the School of Athens, manifest the alliance between faith and reason, placing ancient philosophers at the heart of an ideal architectural setting inspired by humanism. The construction site of the new St. Peter's Basilica, undertaken by Julius II, illustrates the grand vision of the papacy at that time. Bramante designed a Greek cross plan, topped with a colossal dome intended to reflect the spiritual sovereignty of Rome. However, the works were costly and required considerable resources, especially as the Pope simultaneously conducted military campaigns to reconquer the Papal States. Despite these challenges, Julius II used all the diplomatic and financial means at his disposal, including raising taxes in territories under his control. Through this immense architectural project, he sought to affirm the primacy of the Bishop of Rome over Christendom, while attracting pilgrims and artists to the heart of the Eternal City. The result, even unfinished at his death in 1513, remains one of the most powerful symbols of the Renaissance papacy. Upon the death of Julius II, Leo X from the Medici family was elected in 1513. Refined and an art lover, he continued the completion of St. Peter's Basilica, although Bramante's plans evolved under different architects. To fund these costly works and maintain the luxury of the papal court, Leo X favored the sale of indulgences, a practice already stirring some dissent within Christendom. While perpetuating the cultural brilliance of the papacy, his pontificate is marked by growing opulence, foreshadowing forthcoming religious tensions. The first half of the 16th century saw a profound contestation arise within the Western Church, whose authority was then concentrated in the hands of the Pope in Rome. For a large number of believers, the abuses related to the sale of indulgences and the sometimes ostentatious wealth of the clergy provoked growing dissatisfaction. It was in this context that, according to tradition, the German Augustinian monk Martin Luther published his 95 Theses in 1517, openly criticizing certain aspects of ecclesiastical doctrine and practice. His gesture received considerable echo, notably thanks to the printing press, which allowed for the rapid and widespread dissemination of his ideas. The reaction of the Catholic Church was not long in coming. Pope Leo X, faced with the agitation caused by Luther's positions, first sought to bring him back to obedience through discussions and warnings. Faced with the reformer's persistent refusal to recant his theses, Leo X ultimately pronounced Luther's excommunication in 1521. By that time, the rupture had become irreversible for a part of the German population, supported by certain princes of the Holy Roman Empire. This political support provided the reform movement with essential protection, while further anchoring the protest within power structures. Beyond the Germanic borders, the will for reform quickly spreads to Switzerland, France, England, and other European countries. However, Rome remains the nerve center of Catholicism. It experiences a major drama in 1527, the sack of the city by the imperial troops of Charles V, then at war against the King of France, Francis III. The soldiers, mostly poorly paid, engage in pillaging and destruction that traumatize the papacy for the long term. This event signifies a decline in political prestige, as the temporal power of the Pope now suffers from a humiliating challenge. Despite this blow to Roman influence, the papacy seeks to redefine its spiritual authority. In response to the proliferation of Protestant movements, it reacts by convening the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563 under the aegis of several pontiffs, including Paul III, Julius III, and Pius IV. This council, described as Tridentine in reference to the Italian town of Trent, aims to be a firm response to the doctrinal criticisms expressed by Luther and other reformers. The Conciliar Fathers state clear dogmas on justification, the transmission of grace, and the place of the sacraments, while insisting on the need for renewed Catholic discipline. The Council of Trent does not limit itself to setting theological principles. It also advocates a profound reform of clergy formation, encourages the founding of seminaries, and strengthens the supervision of priests by bishops. Thus, the ecclesiastical institution attempts to bridge the gap between the people and their pastors, while reaffirming the authority of the sovereign pontiff. The doctrinal decisions confirm the validity of Catholic traditions, notably the Mass as a sacrifice and the veneration of saints. This counter-reformation, as it will be called, marks a new stage in Western religious history, now divided into two major blocks. The issue of the use of religious images and popular piety is also addressed at the Council of Trent. Aware that excessive devotion to relics and statues could lend itself to Protestant criticism, the Conciliar Fathers affirm the legitimacy of venerating sacred representations, while calling for greater sobriety. This desire to balance piety comes with an effort to better control the distribution of theological works. An index of forbidden books is established to prevent the spread of ideas deemed heretical. These measures, both disciplinary and educational, further reinforce the structured character of post-Tridentine Catholicism. By this means, Rome effectively protects the faithful by firmly overseeing intellectual production. In parallel, new religious orders emerged to support this dynamic of Catholic renewal. One of the most influential is the Society of Jesus, approved in 1540 by Pope Paul III. The members of this order, known as Jesuits, dedicate themselves to teaching, preaching, and mission. Their intellectual commitment is manifested through the creation of colleges and universities, which educate Catholic elites in many kingdoms. Additionally, the Jesuits embark on distant missions. They evangelize in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, faithfully carrying with them the Roman faith. At the same time, the Church also undertakes a revision of the Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 before Christ, deemed imprecise after several centuries of use. Under the guidance of Pope Gregory XIII, a group of mathematicians and astronomers develops a correction system to realign the civil year with the solar year. In 1582, the reform is officially promulgated. 10 days are removed from the calendar to compensate for the accumulated shift, and new rules for calculating leap years are introduced. This Gregorian calendar, still in use today in much of the world, demonstrates the spiritual and cultural role that the papacy intends to continue to play. However, despite these efforts of reaffirmation, Europe plunges into a period of intense religious and political conflicts. Rivalries between Catholic and Protestant sovereigns, supported by shifting alliances, deepen a growing chasm between the confessions. At the beginning of the 17th century, the tension culminates with the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, triggered by disputes in the Holy Roman Empire. Although tactical and dynastic aspects play a major role, religion remains a central motive. During this conflict, the papacy attempts to exert diplomatic influence, but its power is limited in the face of secular powers vying for continental hegemony. To understand the vastness of the conflict, it must be recalled that in 1618, the famous defenestration of Prague serves as a symbolic trigger. Imperial delegates are thrown out of a window of a Bohemian castle, scandalizing the Viennese court and fueling the notion of a Protestant rebellion in imperial territories. Quickly, Catholic powers like Spain or Bavaria mobilize to defend the rights of the House of Austria, while Protestant princes receive support from Sweden and other allies hostile to the Habsburgs. Rome, for its part, supports Catholic efforts through financial subsidies and public prayers, even though its influence remains limited. Its impact, the papacy, symbolizes Catholic unity. The Pontificate of Urban the Feist. Barberini illustrates the complexity of this period. Hailing from a powerful Florentine family, Pope Urban VIII supports certain Catholic factions while fearing a Habsburg hegemony deemed dangerous for the independence of the Holy See. His diplomatic action remains ambivalent. On one hand, he encourages Catholic powers in their fight against Protestants. On the other, he strives to prevent a single confessional bloc from dominating Western Europe. In this troubled context, the papacy finds itself juggling between the spiritual interests it defends and the necessity to preserve its political status in the European concert. After 3 decades of fierce struggle, which ravaged Germany and compromised the European balance, the 30 Years' War ends with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. These agreements formalized the religious fragmentation of Europe, definitively establishing coexistence among multiple confessions within the empire. For the papacy, this evolution marks a loss of influence on the geopolitical stage. Sovereigns gain autonomy against Roman mandates. However, the Pope's spiritual role endures, serving as a rallying point for Catholics, while the institutions established during the Counter-Reformation continue to shape the identity of post-Tridentine Catholicism. In the ensuing decades, the territorial decline of the Papal States was particularly visible in Parma and Ferrara, 2 Italian cities once subject to papal sovereignty. Increasingly integrated into the spheres of influence of European dynasties, these principalities gradually detached from the papal orbit. Successive popes, confronted with the grasp of powerful states like Austria or Spain, struggled to reaffirm their feudal rights. The loss of these territories illustrated a new reality. The political authority of the pontiff, once feared, became marginal in the face of the growth of centralized monarchies and the expansionist ambitions of the great courts. Simultaneously, Louis XIV's France asserted a marked Gallicanism, meaning the desire to exercise increased control over the kingdom's Catholic Church. The 4 Gallican Articles of 1682, promulgated by the Assembly of the Clergy of France, reinforced the idea that the Pope had only limited spiritual authority in national affairs. This doctrine, adopted by the king and many French bishops, aroused opposition from Rome. At the same time, the quarrel of Jansenism, a religious movement inspired by the thought of Bishop Cornelius Jansen, crystallized tensions around grace and predestination, further weakening the unity of the Church in France. The Society of Jesus, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola and becoming a pillar of the Counter-Reformation, found itself at the heart of these doctrinal and political rivalries. The Jesuits, known for their role in education and the defense of papal authority, endured intense hostile campaigns in France, Spain, and Portugal. The Bourbon monarchs, worried about their influence, pressured for their suppression. Finally, Pope Clement XIII ceded to this combined pressure. By the brief Dominus et Redemptor on July 21, 1773, he officially suppressed the order, causing a considerable shock in the Catholic world. In parallel, Europe was entering the Age of Enlightenment, marked by the rise of rational philosophy and the questioning of established dogmas. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu, grouped in the encyclopedist movement, aspired to disseminate scientific knowledge and critical thinking. This intellectual excitement clashed head-on with the ecclesiastical institution attached to a theological vision of the world. The Inquisition, still active in several kingdoms, and the Index of Forbidden Books, maintained by Rome, tried to contain the spread of ideas deemed subversive. Nevertheless, dissent grew, instilling an opposition between faith and reason that shook the Ancien Regime society. The end of the 18th century saw this dissent intensify, particularly in France, where the crown was in the midst of financial and political disarray. The works of philosophers, the economic crisis, and the feeling of social injustice prepared the ground for the French Revolution of 1789. For the papacy, this event was a considerable upheaval. France, long considered the eldest daughter of the Church, was entering an era of secular and anti-clerical upheavals. In a context of radical reforms, Rome's position on the diplomatic scene was called into question, while the French clergy split between reformists and traditionalists. Quite quickly, the Constituent National Assembly adopted the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, promulgated in 1790, which reorganized the Church of France without the approval of the Holy See. Bishops and parish priests became state officials, elected by the population, and had to take an oath to the nation. Pope Pius VI firmly condemned this measure, which he deemed schismatic, but his moral authority was greatly weakened in a kingdom now governed by revolutionary principles. Many ecclesiastics refused to take the oath, while others opted for loyalty to the revolution, deepening the divide between the church faithful to Rome and the new political power. In the wake, the revolution spread through the provinces, and the papal city of Avignon, enclosed within the Kingdom of France, was one of the first affected. The local population, encouraged by new ideas, voted for annexation to France as early as 1791. Rome protested vehemently, but could not prevent the revolutionary grasp on this territory, historically linked to the papacy, since the 14th century. Soon, diplomatic tensions turned into more direct conflicts, fueled by the revolutionary government's desire to break the Church's hold on society and undermine the authority of the sovereign pontiff. The papal condemnation of the revolution, expressed in several briefs and addresses, did not dent the determination of the French revolutionaries. On the contrary, they saw in the opposition of Pius VI the proof that the papal monarchy was setting itself up as an enemy of the new principles of liberty and equality. The Catholic powers of Europe, already in full geopolitical recomposition, hesitated to ally openly with the Pope, fearing to fuel total wars. Gradually, the position of Pius VI became more fragile, especially as the French armies, under the command of Republican generals, gained ground in northern Italy and directly threatened the Papal States. In 1796, General Napoleon Bonaparte began a brilliant campaign in Italy, ousting Austrian armies and forcing Italian princes to conclude treaties favorable to revolutionary France. The victorious battles of Lodi, Arcole, and Rivoli placed the Italian peninsula within the direct sphere of influence of Paris. Faced with these setbacks, Pius VI sought to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Tolentino, signed in February 1797, forced the Holy See to cede important artworks, pay considerable reparations, and concede territories to the north. This capitulation further weakened the image of the Pope, now perceived as a vulnerable sovereign. However, the tension continued to grow. In Rome, riots broke out when supporters of the revolution were attacked by partisans of the papal power. The French authorities, accusing the papal government of repression, sent their troops to occupy the Eternal City. In February 1798, General Louis-Alexandre Berthier proclaimed the Roman Republic, deposing the authority of Pius VI de facto. The old man, already physically weakened, was forced to leave Rome under military escort. Taken into exile in Siena and then to Valencia, he remained a prisoner until his death on August 29, 1799, thus marking the tragic end of his pontificate. This captivity of Pius VI sealed a historical turning point. For the first time in centuries, a pope was deposed by a revolutionary movement and deprived of his temporal power. The Republican will to dismantle the structures of the Ancien Regime signified a radical break with tradition. From now on, the papacy found itself facing a new world, where the principles of equality and popular sovereignty imposed themselves at the expense of ecclesiastical authority. Pope Pius VII, elected in 1800, had to negotiate with Napoleon Bonaparte, who became First Consul and then Emperor. To restore relative stability, they signed the Concordat in 1801, which recognized the Catholic religion in France while accepting the revolutionary seizures. Napoleon, seeking to tame the Church, invited Pius VII to Paris for his coronation, December 2nd, 1804. Despite the pontiff's presence, he crowned himself, signifying his independence from Rome. The Papal States, located in the center of the Italian peninsula, became a target of imperial ambition. The Pope found himself forced to compromise with a regime that continually expanded its possessions, gradually undermining the temporal authority that Rome had enjoyed for centuries. The relationship worsened when Napoleon annexed Rome in 1809, considering the Pope's political authority incompatible with his unifying projects. Pius VII, outraged, excommunicated the emperor. In retaliation, the latter had the pontiff arrested, first held in Savona, then transferred to Fontainebleau. Under intense pressure, the Pope signed a new concordat in 1813, but disavowed it shortly thereafter, arguing he was coerced. The fall of Napoleon, initiated by the debacle of the Russian campaign in 1812, allowed Pius VII to regain his freedom in 1814. The Congress of Vienna restored part of the Papal States, although these did not reach their previous extent. The papacy regained a form of sovereignty in central Italy, but its authority continued to depend largely on the European balance. After 1815, the Restoration returned many sovereigns to their thrones, including the Pope in his territories. However, the liberal and nationalist movement was growing in Italy. Pius IX, elected in 1846, began by introducing some reforms in the Papal States. However, under the impetus of the 1848 uprisings, which spread across Europe, the situation flared up. The Romans demanded a republic, and, in February 1849, Giuseppe Mazzini proclaimed the Roman Republic. The Pope fled to Gaeta. Only the French military intervention, led by General Oudinot, managed to restore papal power in July 1849. This failed revolution and its repression marked the beginning of a rift between the papacy and the Italian nationalist movement, ready to unite to create a single state where Rome would be the natural capital. From 1859 to 1861, the Italian unification process, known as the Risorgimento, took decisive steps thanks to the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia and its Prime Minister, Count Cavour. With the support of Napoleon III, Lombardy was wrested from Austria. Several duchies in central Italy voted their merger with Piedmont, reducing the papal influence zone. In 1860, the Marches in Umbria also joined the new Italian state. When Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed King of Italy in 1861, the Papal States retained only a restricted territory around Rome. Pope Pius IX firmly rejected any loss of sovereignty. He believed that the Church's independence depended on having its own territory, free from political interference. Despite the popular will for unification, Rome remained under French protection. While unified Italy consolidates its institutions, Pius IX relies on France to preserve temporal power. Napoleon III maintains a garrison in Rome, preventing Italian patriots from completing their project. However, when Prussia challenges France in 1870, Napoleon III has to repatriate his troops. Deprived of support, the pontifical city becomes vulnerable. The forces of Victor Emmanuel II approach the Eternal City, determined to make it the capital of Italy. On September 20, 1870, the Italian troops breached the walls near Porta Pia, despite the resistance of the pontifical Zouaves. It is the end of the Papal States. Rome is integrated into the kingdom, sealing the long-awaited unification of the peninsula. Pius IX then locks himself in the Vatican, proclaiming himself a prisoner of the new Italian state. It is in this tense climate that the First Vatican Council is convened, inaugurated on December 8, 1869, at St. Peter's Basilica. Pius IX, aware of philosophical and political attacks against the Church, wants to affirm Roman primacy. The Council discusses several subjects, including the famous question of papal infallibility, asserting that the Pope cannot err when defining ex cathedra, a doctrine concerning faith or morals. On July 18, 1870, the Constitution Pastor Aeternus officially proclaims this dogma. Ironically, this dogmatic affirmation occurs as temporal power collapses. The fighting around Rome forces the Council to suspend its work. Thus, while the Holy See's spiritual authority is strengthened, its territorial anchorage collapses under the pressure of the Italian national movement. In September 1870, as Italian troops breached the walls of Rome through the Porta Pia Gap, the ancient temporal power of the popes, in place since the High Middle Ages, collapses abruptly. Pius IX, the reigning pontiff, finds himself deprived of the papal states, annexed to the Kingdom of Italy. For the first time in centuries, the Pope no longer has an independent territory. He proclaims himself a prisoner in the Vatican, thus protesting the confiscation of his sovereignty and refusing any agreement with the Italian authorities. Symbolically, the pontifical palace is close to official representatives. Without decisive support from Catholic powers, the papacy enters an era of political isolation, while Italy forges its unified identity. The conflict between tradition and national liberalism emerges as the Vatican struggles to find its place in the nascent Italian order. Earlier, in 1864, Pius IX published his Syllabus Errorum, a text condemning 80 errors deemed threatening to the faith. Rationalism, political liberalism, and socialism were discredited, marking a break between the Vatican and the emerging modernity. Published during a time of major scientific and social upheavals, this document took on the value of a manifesto against the spirit of the age. In several Catholic nations, it heightened tensions between proponents of philosophical freedom and defenders of strict orthodoxy. In doing so, it helped divide public opinion by laying the groundwork for a long standoff between the Church and national societies. Foreshadowing Pius IX's intransigent stance after 1870, the syllabus already illustrated his resolute rejection of the modern world. The definitive loss of the Papal States in 1870 confirms the birth of a unified Italian political system centered around a constitutional monarchy. Rome, a symbol of universal history, becomes the administrative and cultural heart of a modern Italy. In this new order, the Pope no longer officially has sovereign territory, except for palaces and basilicas under moral control, but without an army. This challenge to papal power anchors a lasting opposition between the Vatican and the Italian government, leading to decades of negotiations. Meanwhile, the papacy will refocus its action towards pastoral, missionary, and doctrinal domains, seeking to bolster its spiritual authority beyond Europe, as Italy refuses to recognize its temporal independence. Upon the death of Pius IX in 1878, his successor Leo III inherited a church confined within the Vatican walls. Nicknamed the Workers' Pope, he demonstrated a keen sense of diplomacy. Eager to restore the Holy See's image, he multiplied contacts with European regimes and engaged in cautious dialogue with the French Republic. While he remained attached to papal primacy, Leo III primarily sought to make the church influential on moral and social grounds. He encouraged the rediscovery of Thomistic thought, which he believed was capable of addressing contemporary challenges. Under his pontificate, Rome did not regain any official territorial extent, but amplified its intellectual influence. The foundations of a new strategy were laid, addressing contemporary issues through doctrinal teachings. Leo III became globally known with the encyclical Rerum Novarum, published in 1891. For the first time, a pope deeply examined the social question, denouncing the abuses of nascent capitalism. He recognized the workers' right to a fair wage and legal protection while rejecting atheistic socialism deemed incompatible with faith. Laying the foundations of the Church's social doctrine, this encyclical garnered considerable attention beyond religious circles. Various governments drew inspiration from it to design labor legislation laws. This engagement conferred upon Leo III an unexpected aura of modernity, even though the papacy remained politically isolated in Italy. By focusing on the Church's universal mission, he managed to restore a form of moral prestige to it. The death of Leo III in 1903 paved the way for the election of Pius X, born Giuseppe Sarto. His priority was the fight against modernism, a theological movement seeking to adapt faith to contemporary ideas. Fearing dangerous relativism, Pius X published the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis in 1907, which harshly condemned all forms of biblical criticism deemed too liberal. He also instituted the anti-modernist oath, requiring every priest to swear complete fidelity to traditional doctrine. Simultaneously, Pius X undertook a reform of canon law to more clearly codify ecclesiastical rules. Though he remained intransigent on the lost sovereignty of the popes, Pius X's pontificate was marked by a desire to strengthen the Church's moral and doctrinal authority in the face of innovative currents. The conflagration of 1914 took Pius X by surprise, and he died a few weeks after the hostilities began. His successor, Benedict XV, attempted to maintain the Church's neutrality in the face of an unprecedented European conflict. Despite his appeals for peace, his proposals were ignored by the belligerents. After the war, the political map was transformed. Several monarchies collapsed while new states emerged. In Italy, the economic and social crisis favored the rise of extreme movements. Among them, Benito Mussolini quickly gained attention, exploiting popular discontent. The Vatican observed the evolving Italian situation with caution, still marked by the symbolic martyrdom of the Roman question. Although officially still in conflict with the Italian state, the Holy See sought a way to break the diplomatic impasse. Hopes turned to a potential mutual recognition to redefine the papacy's status and put an end to the prisoner of the Vatican figure. However, negotiation required a delicate interaction with an authoritarian regime that intended to consolidate its legitimacy, including by associating with religious symbols. In 1922, Cardinal Achille Radi was elected as Pope under the name of Pius V. A keen observer of geopolitical changes, he sought to strengthen the diplomatic role of the Holy See. His motto, Pax Christi in Regno Christi, the peace of Christ in the reign of Christ, reflected his ambition to ease international tensions while reaffirming the spiritual primacy of the Pope. In Italy, Mussolini gained full powers and sought to consolidate his position by resolving the Roman question. On his side, Pius V saw this as an opportunity to restore, at least partially, the temporal independence of the papacy. Negotiations began in the utmost secrecy, led by Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, Secretary of State, and the emissaries of the new regime. The negotiations were complex. They had to reconcile the Pope's demands for sovereignty with the nationalist claims of the regime, which wanted to make rapprochement with the Church, a symbol of its legitimacy. Despite differences, each found common ground in an agreement capable of ending more than half a century of conflict. It remained to finalize the legal and financial clauses and to determine the status of the future Vatican City. On February 11, 1929, Pius V and Benito Mussolini finally signed the Lateran Accords. These included three components: a treaty recognizing the Pope's sovereignty over a tiny state, Vatican City, of only 44 hectares, a concordat governing relations between the Church and the Italian state, and a financial convention providing compensation for the loss of the former papal states. This compromise settled the Roman question and officially ended the status of prisoner of the Vatican. In the eyes of the world, the papacy became once again a recognized player on the international stage, with its own territory, even if modest. For Mussolini, this agreement conferred considerable prestige on the regime and gained the support of many Italian Catholics. The Vatican, for its part, managed to secure its spiritual independence and gain diplomatic legitimacy. Although the shadow of totalitarianism loomed over Italy and the papacy was confronted with new ambiguities, the Lateran Accords inaugurated an unprecedented era. This recognition brought a new dynamism to the Church during the interwar period. They sealed the end of a long period of uncompromising opposition and reshaped the place of the Holy See in 20th century Europe. Since the signing of the Lateran Accords in 1929, the papacy has experienced a short century of exceptional intensity. Only 8 pontiffs, Pius V, Pius X, John XXIII, Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict XV, and Francis, have guided the Church through the geopolitical, cultural, and spiritual upheavals of the contemporary world. The pontificate of Pius V, marked by the rise of totalitarianisms, laid the groundwork for an active defense of freedoms as Europe descended into extremes. His successor, Pius X, had to face World War II and the burning question of the Holy See's attitude towards persecutions. With John XXIII, a wind of renewal blew. Vatican II opened the Church to modern dialogue and allowed, under Paul VI, a universal diplomacy made of unprecedented travels and social encyclicals. After the very brief interlude of John Paul III, John Paul II made Rome a global platform, accompanying the end of the Cold War and embodying a globalized Catholicism. The theological transition of Benedict XVI was concluded by the first papal resignation in 6 centuries. Finally, Francis, the first Latin American pope. His death on April 21, 2025, Easter Monday of the Jubilee year, closed this cycle of nearly 12 years of pastoral work. The Holy See, now strong in a consolidated sovereignty, but also exposed to the challenges of secularization, awaits its 269th successor of Peter. At the dawn of a new conclave, the millennial legacy of Rome continues to reinvent itself, a living testimony of an institution capable of remaining, despite crises and transformations, one of the moral consciences of the world.